In the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, a desperate young solicitor, John Hector McFarlane, bursts into 2-1B Baker Street, accused of a brutal murder he swears he didn't commit. A bloody thumbprint, a charred heap of bones, and a mysterious fire at Deepdene House point to his guilt, but Sherlock Holmes smells deception. As he unravels a web of blackmail, forged evidence, and a cunningly staged disappearance, Holmes discovers that Jonas Oldacre, the supposed victim, is not only alive, but the architect of a sinister plot to escape his debts and ruin an innocent man. With time running out, Holmes springs a trap to reveal the truth, proving that no scheme can outwit the master detective. Chapter 1. A client in distressing the autumn of 1894, when the leaves of London turned to russet and gold, and a damp chill hung in the air. I found myself once again in the familiar confines of 2-1B Baker Street. My friend and companion, Sherlock Holmes, was in one of his restless moods, a state I had come to recognize as a dangerous prelude to either brilliance or mischief. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the walls, where maps, chemical apparatus, and the paraphernalia of his trade lay in their usual disarray. Holmes paced the room, his lean figure clad in a dressing gown, his pipe sending spirals of smoke toward the ceiling. His sharp grey eyes, usually so piercing, were clouded with the ennui that plagued him when no case stirred his remarkable intellect. I sat by the fire, engrossed in a medical journal, though my attention wandered to Holmes's restless movements. For days, no client had crossed our threshold, and the absence of a problem to unravel left him like a hound without a scent. I ventured to remark upon it. "Holmes," said I, "you are like a caged lion. Surely there is some small matter in the papers to pique your interest." He paused, fixing me with a wry glance. "The papers, Watson, are filled with the banalities of petty theft and domestic squabbles. A man of my tastes requires something more singular to rouse his faculties." I returned to my journal, knowing better than to press him further. It was then that a sharp knock at the door broke the silence, followed by the soft tread of Mrs. Hudson, our long-suffering landlady. She entered, her face bearing that look of mingled apprehension and resignation that so often accompanied the announcement of a visitor. "Double quotes, Mr. Holmes," she said. "There is a gentleman to see you. He is in a dreadful state, sir, quite beside himself." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and let us see what storm has driven him to our door." Moments later, a young man burst into the room, his appearance confirming Mrs. Hudson's description. He was tall, with a slight stoop, as though the weight of his troubles pressed upon his shoulders. His hair, dark and disheveled, clung damply to his forehead, and his eyes, wide with panic, darted about the room as if expecting pursuit. His clothes, though well cut, were crumpled, and his hands trembled as he clutched a small leather satchel. He could not have been more than 30, yet his face bore the pallor of one who had aged a decade in a single night. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he gasped, his voice hoarse with agitation. "I am he," Holmes replied, motioning to a chair. "Pray, sit down, sir, and compose yourself. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who may be trusted implicitly. Now, state your name and your trouble, and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." The young man sank into the chair, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "My name is John Hector McFarlane," he said, "and I am a solicitor, though a junior partner in a modest firm. I am in the most desperate straits, Mr. Holmes. The police are after me, and I swear before heaven that I am innocent of any crime." Holmes leaned forward, his languor replaced by that keen alertness which I knew signaled the awakening of his extraordinary mind. "Innocent of what, Mr. McFarlane? Speak plainly, and let us have the facts." McFarlane drew a trembling hand across his brow, as though to steady himself. "I am accused," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "of the murder of Mr. Jonas Aldecker, a builder of Norwood. They say I killed him and burned his house to conceal the deed, but I did no such thing. I beg you, Mr. Holmes, to believe me and to help me, for I know not where else to turn." Holmes's expression remained impassive, but I could see the spark of curiosity in his eyes. "Watson," he said, turning to me, "be so good as to take notes. This promises to be a case of some interest. Now, Mr. McFarlane, begin at the beginning and leave nothing out." McFarlane nodded, though his hands still shook as he clasped them tightly in his lap. "I am a solicitor, as I said, with the firm of Graham and McFarlane in Lincoln's Inn. We are not a large concern, but we have a respectable practice, handling wills, conveyances, and the like. Yesterday morning, I received a letter from Mr. Jonas Aldecker, a man of considerable wealth who resided, I should sat Deep Dean House in Norwood. He requested my services in drafting a will, as he wished to settle his affairs. The letter was urgent, insisting that I meet him at his home that evening, as he had pressing reasons for haste." Holmes interrupted. "Did you know Aldecker prior to this letter?" "No, sir," McFarlane replied. "I had heard his name, for he is well known in Norwood as a builder of some repute, but I had never met him. His letter came as a surprise, but such requests are not uncommon in my profession, and I saw no reason to decline." "Go on," Holmes said, lighting a fresh pipe and settling back in his chair. "I arrived at Deep Dean House shortly after 9 o'clock, McFarlane continued. "It is a large, rambling place, set back from the road, with a garden and high walls. Aldecker himself answered the door, which struck me as odd, for I expected a servant. He was a man of middle age, perhaps 50, with a thin, sallow face and a manner that was both abrupt and secretive. He led me to his study, a cluttered room filled with papers and architectural plans, and we set to work on the will." Here McFarlane paused, his eyes flickering with unease. "The will was peculiar. Mr. Holmes, Aldecker directed me to leave the bulk of his estate to various charitable institutions, hospitals, orphanages, and the like. There was no mention of family or close associates, save for a small bequest to myself, which he insisted upon as a token for my services. I found it strange, for a man of his wealth might be expected to have kin or friends, but he was adamant. We worked late, past 11, and I left near midnight, the will drafted and ready for signing." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And Aldecker was alive and well when you departed?" "Absolutely," McFarlane said earnestly. "He saw me to the door himself, and I caught the last train back to London. I thought no more of it until this morning, when I was awakened by a constable at my lodgings. He informed me that Deep Dean House had burned in the night, and that evidence had been found, suggesting foul play. They believe I murdered Aldecker and set the fire to cover my tracks." "What evidence do they claim?" Holmes asked, his tone sharp. McFarlane's face grew paler still. "A bloody thumbprint on the wall of the hallway, which they say is mine. And in the garden, they found a charred heap, which they believe to be Aldecker's remains, though so badly burned as to be unrecognizable. They say I must have struck him down, then started the fire to destroy the evidence. But I swear, Mr. Holmes, I did no such thing. I left him alive, and I never touched a match." Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A thumbprint," he murmured. "Most damning, if true. And the remains, have they been examined by a medical man?" "I know not," McFarlane said, his voice breaking. "I fled to you as soon as I heard. The constable was preparing to arrest me, and I could not bear the thought of a cell. I have no one else, Mr. Holmes. My parents are dead. My firm will surely dismiss me, and the police are convinced of my guilt." Holmes rose abruptly, his movements brisk. "Watson, pack your bag. We are for Norwood. Mr. McFarlane, you will remain here until our return. Mrs. Hudson will see to your needs, but you must not leave these rooms. The police will be watching, and your safety depends on discretion." McFarlane nodded, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I place myself entirely in your hands." As I gathered my things, I glanced at Holmes, whose face now bore that intense concentration which I knew presaged a hunt. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked as we descended the stairs. "A singular affair, Watson," he replied. "A thumbprint, a fire, a missing man, and a will that raises more questions than it answers. There is a mind at work here, and I intend to know it." We took a hansom to the station, catching the midday train to Norwood. As the countryside rolled past, I pondered McFarlane's tale. The young man's terror had been genuine, his story consistent, yet the evidence against him was formidable. Holmes, however, seemed unperturbed, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his mind already sifting through the threads of the mystery. Norwood was a quiet suburb, its streets lined with neat villas and the occasional larger estate. Deep Dean House stood at the edge of the town, a sprawling structure of timber and brick, its upper floors now blackened and partially collapsed from the fire. A crowd of curious onlookers lingered at the gate, held back by a pair of constables. Inspector Lestrade, that ferret-like figure from Scotland Yard, awaited us at the entrance, his expression a mixture of smugness and irritation. "Well, Holmes," said he, "you've come to see my handiwork, have you? This is as clear a case as I've ever seen. McFarlane's your man, and I'll have him in irons before nightfall." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Clarity, Lestrade, is often the cloak of error. Let us examine the scene before you crow too loudly." Lestrade snorted, but led us into the house. The hallway was a ruin, its walls scorched and its air heavy with the acrid smell of smoke. The thumbprint, a vivid smear of crimson, stood out starkly against the charred plaster. Holmes knelt beside it, his magnifying lens in hand, studying it with the intensity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. He made no comment, but moved to the garden, where a tarpaulin covered a heap of ashes and bone fragments. "This," Lestrade said, lifting the cover, "is what's left of Jonah's old acre, burned to a cinder, but the size and shape match his frame." Holmes sifted through the debris, his fingers deft and precise. "Curious," he murmured. "The fire was intense, yet the bones are oddly uniform. Watson, what do you make of these remains?" I examined them, my medical training coming to the fore. "They are badly burned," I said, "but the fragments suggest a small stature. It is difficult to say more without a proper analysis." Holmes nodded, his expression inscrutable. He continued his inspection, noting the position of the fire's origin, a corner of the study. where traces of oil were evident. He paced the grounds, his eyes scanning every detail, from the scorched earth to the shattered windows above. At length, he straightened, brushing soot from his hands. "Lestrade," said he, "have you considered that these remains may not be human?" "Not human," Lestrade laughed. "What else could they be? A dog? A pig?" Holmes did not reply, but his silence was eloquent. He turned to me. "Watson, we shall return to Baker Street. There is much to consider, and I require my files." As we boarded the train, I ventured to ask, "Do you believe McFarlane innocent, Holmes?" "I believe nothing, Watson, until the facts compel me," he replied. "But I suspect we are dealing with a scheme more intricate than Lestrade imagines. A thumbprint is a simple thing to forge, and a fire is a convenient veil." Back at Baker Street, Holmes dismissed McFarlane to a spare room, where the young man collapsed in exhaustion. Holmes seated himself at his desk, surrounded by a chaos of papers and chemical vials. "Watson," said he, "this case is a tapestry of deception. Oldacre's will, the thumbprint, the firewall are threads in a pattern we have yet to discern. Tomorrow we shall seek the housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, and learn what she knows of her master's secrets." I retired to my room, my mind awhirl with the day's events. Holmes remained at his desk, his pipe glowing in the darkness, his thoughts already weaving the strands of the mystery into a coherent whole. As I drifted to sleep, I could not shake the feeling that we stood on the threshold of a revelation, one that would test even Holmes's formidable powers. The following morning promised new clues, and I knew my friend would pursue them with the relentless precision that had made him the foremost detective of our age. For now, however, the shadows of Norwood held their secrets close, and only time would yield them to Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the midday train from London to Norwood, rattled through the suburbs, its rhythm a counterpoint to the restless energy of Sherlock Holmes, who sat opposite me, his sharp features set in a mask of intense concentration. The autumn landscape, with its patchwork of fading green and russet, passed unnoticed by my friend, whose mind was already dissecting the enigma of John Hector McFarlane's predicament. I, too, was preoccupied, my thoughts turning over the young solicitor's tale of a bloody thumbprint, a charred heap, and a fire that had consumed Deepdene House. The gravity of the accusations against McFarlane weighed heavily, and I wondered what clues the ruined estate might yield to Holmes's keen scrutiny. We alighted at Norwood Station, where the air carried a faint temps of smoke, a lingering reminder of the previous night's conflagration. The town was abuzz with the morbid curiosity that follows such tragedies. And as we made our way to Deepdene House, we passed knots of townsfolk whispering behind gloved hands. The house itself stood at the end of a quiet lane, its once facade now marred by blackened timbers and shattered windows. A high wall enclosed the property, its iron gate guarded by a burly constable who nodded us through with a wary glance. Inspector Lestrade awaited us at the entrance, his lean frame and ferret-like features, as familiar as they were exasperating. He greeted Holmes with a mixture of professional courtesy and thinly veiled skepticism, his small eyes glinting with the confidence of a man who believed his case already solved. "Well, Holmes," said he, clapping his hands together, "you've come to admire my work, I presume. This is as neat a piece of villainy as I've seen in years. Your client, McFarlane, is our man, and I'll stake my badge on it." Holmes's lips curled into a faint, sardonic smile. "Your confidence is admirable, Lestrade, but premature. Let us see the evidence before you fit the noose." Lestrade shrugged. undeterred, and led us into the wreckage of Deep Dean House. The interior was a scene of devastation. The hallway, once panelled in dark oak, was now a charred skeleton, its walls streaked with soot, and its floor littered with debris. The acrid stench of burned wood and fabric hung heavy in the air, stinging the eyes and throat. My medical instincts recoiled at the thought of what might lie beneath the rubble. But Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes darting from one detail to another, cataloguing the scene with the precision of a machine. Our first stop was the hallway, where the infamous thumbprint stood out in stark relief against a patch of scorched plaster. It was a vivid smear, unmistakably blood, its whorls and ridges clear even to the untrained eye. Lestrade pointed to it with a flourish, as if presenting a trophy. "There's your proof, Holmes," he said. "We took McFarlane's prints this morning, and they matched to a hair. He was here, and he left his mark in blood." Holmes knelt beside the print, his magnifying lens poised like a jeweler's loop. He studied it in silence, his long fingers tracing the air above the mark, as though measuring its placement. I watched, familiar with the intensity of his focus, knowing that he saw details invisible to Lestrade or myself. At length, he rose, his expression unreadable. "A remarkable print," he murmured, "so clear, so perfectly placed, almost too perfect, would you not say, Watson?" I frowned, uncertain of his meaning. "It is damning evidence, Holmes. If it is McFarlane's, as Lestrade claims, it places him at the scene of a violent act." Holmes's eyes flickered with a trace of amusement. "If, Watson, a small word, but a significant one. Let us reserve judgment until we have seen more." Lestrade led us next to the garden, where a tarpaulin covered a grim pile of ashes and bone fragments, the supposed remains of Jonas Oldecker. The garden itself was a tangled mess, its lawn scorched and its flower beds trampled by the boots of constables and onlookers. The heap lay near a low hedge, its contents partially exposed to the damp air. Lestrade lifted the cover, revealing a mass of charred material, interspersed with fragments of bone and scraps of cloth. "Here's what's left of Oldecker," Lestrade said, his voice tinged with grim satisfaction. "The fire was fierce, but we've enough to identify him. The size and build match, and we found a ring nearby, engraved with his initials." I bent closer, my medical training asserting itself. The remains were pitifully meager, reduced to a jumble of ash and bone. The fragments were small, their surfaces blackened and cracked by heat. I could discern no clear anatomical structure, but the presence of cloth suggested clothing, and the bones, though shattered, were consistent with human proportions. "What do you make of it, Watson?" Holmes asked, his tone neutral. I hesitated, aware of Lestrade's scrutiny. "The remains are badly burned," I said. "It is difficult to be certain without a proper examination, but they could belong to a man of Oldecker's stature. The cloth suggests he was dressed, perhaps in a coat or jacket." Holmes nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. He knelt beside the heap, sifting through the ashes with a small stick, his movements deliberate. He extracted a fragment of bone, holding it to the light, then pocketed it with a casual air that belied his purpose. Rising, he surveyed the garden, his gaze lingering on the hedge and the surrounding earth. "Lestrade," said he, "have you determined the origin of the fire?" "Of course," Lestrade replied, leading us back to the house. "It started in the study, where we found traces of oil and a broken lamp. McFarlane must have knocked it over after doing the deed, setting the place ablaze. The study was a ruin, its bookshelves collapsed, its desk reduced to a skeleton of charred wood. Holmes examined the floor, where a dark stain marked the spot where the lamp had fallen. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring, then scraped a sample of the residue into a small envelope. Oil, indeed, he said, but the distribution is curious. A lamp, broken accidentally, would scatter its contents unevenly. This stain suggests a more deliberate application. Lestrade scoffed. You're splitting hairs, Holmes. The lamp was broken, the oil spilled, and the fire started. It's plain as day. Holmes did not reply, but his silence was eloquent. He continued his inspection, moving from the study to the adjacent rooms, noting the pattern of the fire's spread. The upper floors, though damaged, were less affected, their contents partially preserved. In a bedroom, he paused to examine a wardrobe, its doors hanging askew. Inside, he found a collection of coats, one of which bore a faint stain on its cuff. Blood? I asked, peering over his shoulder. Possibly, Holmes replied, folding the coat carefully. We shall see what the laboratory reveals. As we returned to the garden, Holmes's attention shifted to the grounds themselves. He paced the perimeter, his eyes scanning the earth for signs of disturbance. Near the hedge, he paused, crouching to examine a patch of soil. With a small trowel, he dug gently, uncovering a faint impression of footprint, partially obscured by the trampling of the constables. Interesting, he said, sketching the outline in his notebook. A man's boot, but smaller than one. Might expect. Not McFarlane's, I wager. Lestrade, growing impatient, crossed his arms. What are you driving at, Holmes? Footprints, stains, bones here, making a mystery where none exists. Holmes straightened, his expression cool. On the contrary, Lestrade, I am unmaking a mystery that has been too hastily constructed. Watson, we have seen enough for now. Let us return to Baker Street. As we made our way back to the station, I could not resist pressing him. Holmes, what do you make of it all? The thumbprint, the remains, the fire due, they point to Guilt. Holmes's eyes glinted with that familiar fire. They point, Watson, but not where Lestrade thinks. The thumbprint is too pristine, the remains too convenient, and the fire too well teamed. We are dealing with a mind that seeks to deceive, and I intend to uncover its purpose. We boarded the train, the smoke of Norwood fading behind us. Holmes sat in silence, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the armrest, his mind already weaving the threads of the case into a pattern only he could see. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts, but as the lights of London came into view, I felt a growing certainty that Deep Dean House held secrets yet to be revealed, and that Sherlock Holmes was the man to unearth them. Chapter 3. The singular Wilther gas lamps of Baker Street glowed dimly through the fog as our hansom rattled to a stop before 221B. The journey from Norwood had been one of silence. Sherlock Holmes lost in that inward contemplation which I knew marked the workings of his extraordinary mind. I, too, was preoccupied, my thoughts tangled with the grim relics of Deep Dean House, the bloody thumbprint, the charred remains, and the lingering question of Jonas Oldacre's fate. The accusations against John Hector McFarlane were grave, yet Holmes's cryptic remarks on the train suggested a deeper complexity to the affair, one that eluded the blunt certainties of Inspector Lestrade. We ascended the familiar stairs to our rooms, where we found McFarlane pacing like a caged animal, his face drawn with anxiety. The young solicitor had obeyed Holmes's instruction to remain, though his nerves were clearly frayed by the hours of waiting. Mrs. Hudson, ever attentive, had provided him with tea and a modest supper, but the tray sat untouched on the table. "Mr. Holmes," MacFarlane exclaimed as we entered, "have you news? Is there hope for me?" Holmes waved him to a chair with a gesture that was both commanding and reassuring. "Patience, Mr. MacFarlane," said he, removing his coat and settling into his armchair. "We have seen the scene of your supposed crime, and I have gathered certain facts. But first I require the documents pertaining to Oldacre's will. You have them with you, I presume?" MacFarlane nodded eagerly, fumbling with the leather satchel he had clutched since his arrival. From it, he produced a sheaf of papers, bound with a ribbon and marked with the spidery handwriting of Jonas Oldacre. "Here they are," he said, handing them to Holmes. "This is the draft of the will, as I prepared it under his direction. It is not yet signed, as he wished to review it further, but it contains all his instructions." Holmes took the papers, his long fingers handling them with the care of an antiquarian examining a rare manuscript. He lit a fresh pipe, the smoke curling about him as he began to read, his eyes moving swiftly over the text. I took my place by the fire, notebook in hand, ready to record any observations he might share. MacFarlane watched with bated breath, his hands clasped tightly, as though the documents held his very life. The will, as MacFarlane had described, was a curious document. It began with the usual formalities, naming Jonas Oldacre, builder of Dean House, Norwood, as the testator. The bulk of his estate, which included considerable properties and investments, was bequeathed to a series of charitable institutions, a hospital in Southwark, an orphanage in Lambeth, and a society for the relief of indigent craftsmen. The sums were substantial, running to tens of thousands of pounds, yet there was no mention of family, friends, or personal associates, save for a modest legacy of £500 to MacFarlane himself, described as payment for professional services and in recognition of his diligence. Holmes paused, his brow furrowing as he reached a clause near the end. "This is most singular," he murmured, tapping the page with his finger. "Oldacre stipulates that his house, Deep Dean, be sold and the proceeds divided among these charities, with the condition that it be demolished within 6 months of his death. Why such haste to destroy a valuable property? I ventured an opinion. Perhaps he wished to ensure no one else could claim it." Holmes shook his head. "A man of Oldacre's temperament does not act without motive, Watson," demolition suggests. "A desire to erase something, perhaps evidence of some kind. We shall see." He turned to MacFarlane. "Tell me, sir, did Oldacre give any reason for this unusual distribution of his wealth? Did he speak of family, or of any person who might have expected to inherit?" MacFarlane shook his head. "None, Mr. Holmes. He was most emphatic that his fortune go to these charities. He said he had no kin to speak of, and that his life's work was better served by aiding those in need. I pressed him, as is my duty, to ensure he was certain, but he grew irritable and bade me follow his instructions without question." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And his manner during your meeting, describe it precisely." MacFarlane hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "He was cordial at first, but there was an edge to him, a nervousness I could not place. He kept glancing at the window, as though expecting someone, and he locked the study door while we worked. When we finished, he seemed relieved, almost eager to see me gone. I thought it odd, but I attributed it to the lateness of the hour." Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Locked the door, did he? And you were certain? The housekeeper was not present?" "Quite certain," MacFarlane replied. Oldacre said she left at 7 each evening, and he let me in himself. I saw no one else in the house. Holmes set the will aside and rose, pacing the room with that restless energy I knew signaled a mind at work. A bachelor of 50, wealthy but reclusive, drafts a will that benefits no one close to him, insists on a late-night meeting, and locks his door against unseen intruders. Then a fire consumes his home, and a thumbprint in blood points to you, Mr. McFarlane. This is no ordinary crime, Watson. There is design here, and a cunning one. I glanced at the papers on the table. Could the will itself be a motive? If McFarlane were to benefit, however modestly, might someone have wished to implicate him? Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. A possibility, Watson, but too simple. The legacy to McFarlane is trifling compared to the estate's value. No, the will is a piece of the puzzle, but not its heart. We must learn more of Oldacre's life, his enemies, his secrets, his habits. He turned to McFarlane. You mentioned. Oldacre's study was cluttered with papers. Did you notice anything unusual among them? Letters, perhaps, or documents that seemed out of place? McFarlane frowned, straining to recall. There were architectural plans, I believe, and stacks of correspondence, but I paid them little mind. My focus was on the will. There was one thing, though Oldacre seemed anxious about a particular drawer in his desk. He opened it briefly to retrieve a pen, and I glimpsed a bundle of letters tied with string, but he shut it quickly and locked it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Letters, you say, and locked away. That is most suggestive. Watson, tomorrow we shall return to Norwood and seek out Mrs. Lexington, the housekeeper. If anyone knows Oldacre's secrets, it will be she. For now, Mr. McFarlane, you will remain here. Mrs. Hudson will provide a bed, and you must not stir until I say. McFarlane nodded, his gratitude tempered by exhaustion. I am in your debt, Mr. Holmes. I only pray you can clear my name. As McFarlane retired, Holmes resumed his pacing, the will still in hand. What do you make of it, Watson? He asked, his voice low. It is a strange document, I replied. A man with no heirs, giving all to charity it, is noble, but unusual. And the clause about demolishing the house is perplexing. Could Oldacre have been hiding something within its walls? Holmes nodded slowly. You are not far wrong, Watson. The house, the will, the fire all point to a man desperate to conceal something. But what, and why implicate McFarlane? There is a thread here, and I mean to follow it. He sat at his desk, pulling a stack of reference books toward him. I shall spend the evening cross-referencing Oldacre's name in my files. He is not unknown to me, Watson, a builder of some repute, but with whispers of sharp practices in his dealings. Tomorrow we shall see what light Mrs. Lexington can shed. I retired to my room, leaving Holmes to his work. The firelight cast long shadows across the walls, and as I drifted to sleep, I could hear the faint scratch of his pen and the occasional rustle of pages. The mystery of Deepdene House was unfolding, and I knew that Sherlock Holmes, with his relentless logic, was already closing in on its heart. Chapter 4. The Housekeeper's Tale. The morning following our return from Norwood dawned grey and damp, with a fog that clung to the streets of London like a shroud. Sherlock Holmes was already at breakfast when I descended, his manner brisk, and his eyes alight with the quiet intensity that marked his pursuit of a case. The papers of Jonas Oldacre's were lay neatly stacked upon the table, beside a tray of toast and coffee, and I noted that Holmes's chair was surrounded by a litter of reference books and newspaper cuttings. Evidence of a night spent in study. Good. "Morning, Watson," said he, glancing up from a volume of architectural journals. "I trust you are prepared for another journey to Norwood. We have an appointment with Mrs. Lexington, Oldacre's housekeeper, and I have a notion she may hold the key to some of our questions." I nodded, helping myself to coffee. "You suspect she knows more than she has told the police?" Holmes's lips curved in a faint smile. "Housekeepers, Watson, are the silent sentinels of a household. They see and hear much that others overlook. Mrs. Lexington has served Oldacre for years, and I wager she has observed habits and visitors that may illuminate this affair." We left Baker Street shortly after, leaving John Hector McFarlane in the care of Mrs. Hudson, with strict instructions to remain hidden. The train to Norwood was less crowded than the previous day, and Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the passing suburbs, though I knew his mind was far from the scenery. I, too, was lost in thought, pondering the peculiar will, the bloody thumbprint, and the charred remains that had so thoroughly convinced Lestrade of McFarlane's guilt. Holmes's doubts about the evidence had planted a seed of curiosity in me, and I was eager to see what new clues this visit might uncover. We arrived in Norwood to find the town still abuzz with gossip about the fire at Dean House. The constables had dispersed the crowds, but a few curious onlookers lingered near the ruined estate. Their whispers hushed as we passed. Mrs. Lexington lived in a modest cottage a short walk from Oldacre's property, its garden neatly tended and its windows curtained against the prying eyes of neighbors. Holmes knocked sharply, and after a moment the door was opened by a stout woman of middle age, her face lined with care and her eyes wary. "Mrs. Lexington?" Holmes inquired, his tone courteous but firm. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are investigating the events at Dean House and would value your assistance." The housekeeper's expression tightened, but she stepped aside to admit us. "I've told the police all I know," she said, her voice low and guarded. "But if you're here to help that poor young man, I'll do what I can." We were ushered into a small parlor, its furnishings simple but well kept, with a faint smell of lavender and beeswax. Mrs. Lexington sat opposite us, her hands folded in her lap, though I noted a slight tremor in her fingers. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed upon her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away pretense. "Double quotes, Mrs. Lexington," he began. "You were in Jonas Oldacre's employ for some years, were you not?" "10 years, sir," she replied. "I came to Dean House when Mr. Oldacre first built it. I kept his home, cooked his meals, and managed the daily affairs." "And his habits?" Holmes asked. "Describe him, if you please, his routines, his temperament, his visitors." Mrs. Lexington hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the window. "Mr. Oldacre was a private man, sir, not given to company. He spent most of his days in his study, working on his plans and accounts. He was a builder, as you know, and had projects all over London, houses, warehouses, that sort of thing. He could be kind, in his way, but he had a sharp tongue when crossed, and he liked things done just so." Holmes nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And his visitors? Did he entertain often?" "Not often," she said. "He had business. Folk now and then, contractors, architects, men of that sort, but he kept them at arm's length. Lately, though, he'd been more secretive. He'd lock himself in his study for hours, and I'd hear him pacing at night. Sometimes he'd burn papers in the grate, and the smell would linger." Holmes's eyes narrowed, Burn papers. What kind of papers? I couldn't say, sir, she replied, her voice dropping. Letters, mostly, from what I glimpsed. He'd stuffed them in the fire before I could see much. But he was particular about his desk, kept certain drawers locked, and warned me never to touch them. I glanced at Holmes, recalling mention of the locked drawer and the bundle of letters. Holmes, however, gave no sign of surprise, his expression as impassive as ever. On the night of the fire, he said, "You left the house at 7, as was your custom." "Yes, sir," Mrs. Lexington said. "Mr. Oldacre insisted I go home each evening. He said he preferred to be alone after dark. I left him in good spirits, or so I thought. He mentioned a visitor coming Latora, young man about a Wilbut. He didn't say who." "That would be Mr. McFarlane," Holmes said. "Did you see him arrive?" "No, sir, I was gone by then. I only heard of the fire the next morning, when the grocer's boy came running with the news." Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Mrs. Lexington, did Mr. Oldacre ever speak of enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm?" She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He never spoke of enemies outright, but he was troubled these past months. He'd mutter about debts and promises when he thought I wasn't listening. Once, I heard him say a name, Vanda, something, a woman's name, I think. He sounded angry, but he clammed up when he saw me." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Vanda, can you recall the full name?" She shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. It was just a snatch of talk, and I didn't catch it clear. I never saw a woman at the house, if that's what you're thinking." Holmes rose, his manner brisk. "You have been most helpful, Mrs. Lexington. One final question. Did Mr. Oldacre ever mention plans to leave Norwood, or to alter his circumstances?" Her eyes widened slightly, as though the question had struck a chord. "Not in so many words, sir, but he did say something odd a week ago. He said, if I could start fresh, I'd leave all this behind and be done with it. I thought he meant his business worries, but he wouldn't say more." Holmes thanked her, and we took our leave, stepping back into the damp Norwood air. As we walked toward the station, I could see the wheels turning in his mind, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. She seemed reluctant to speak freely. "She knows more than she says," Holmes replied, "but fear or loyalty holds her tongue. This Vanda, likely Vanderbilt, a name we shall investigate, suggests a connection Oldacre wished to keep hidden, and his talk of starting fresh, combined with the burning of letters, points to a man seeking to erase his past." "Do you think he staged his own death?" I ventured. Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. "You are ahead of yourself, Watson, but not far wrong. The pieces are falling into place, but we need more data. Those letters in the locked drawer may hold the answer, and I intend to examine them." We boarded the train back to London, Holmes lost in thought, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the window pane. I pondered Mrs. Lexington's words, the image of Oldacre, burning letters and muttering about debts lingering in my mind. The mystery of Deepdene House was growing ever more intricate, and I knew that Holmes, with his relentless curiosity, was already unraveling its threads. Chapter 5. The Thumbprint Puzzle. The fog of London had thickened by the time our train pulled into the station, wrapping the city in a damp, muffling cloak that seemed to mirror the obscurity of the case at hand. Sherlock Holmes, however, was undeterred by the gloom, his step brisk as we made our way back to Baker Street. The revelations of Mrs. Lexington, Oldacre's housekeeper, had set his mind ablaze, and I could see in his sharp, restless movements the signs of a hunter closing in on his quarry. My own thoughts were tangled with the fragments of the mystery, the peculiar will, the charred remains, and, most perplexing of all, the bloody thumbprint that so damningly pointed to John Hector MacFarlane. Holmes's cryptic remarks about its perfection had piqued my curiosity, and I was eager to learn what he made of it. At 2-1B, we found MacFarlane still ensconced in the spare room, his anxiety tempered by exhaustion. He rose as we entered, his eyes searching Holmes's face for some sign of hope. "Any progress, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice strained. "Progress, Mr. MacFarlane, is a matter of accumulating facts," Holmes replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Rest now. You shall hear more when the time is ripe." With a nod, MacFarlane retreated, and Holmes settled into his armchair, lighting a pipe and spreading the papers of Oldacre's will before him. I took my usual place by the fire, notebook at the ready, though I sensed that Holmes's thoughts were not on the will but on the evidence we had seen at Deepdene House. "Watson," said he, after a long silence, "the thumbprint is the pivot of this case. Lestrade places his faith in its clarity, but clarity in evidence is often a trap for the unwary. What do you recall of it?" I thought back to the scorched hallway, the vivid smear of blood standing out against the blackened plaster. "It was remarkably distinct," I said. "The ridges and whorls were clear, as if pressed deliberately." Lestrade said it matched MacFarlane's exactly. Holmes's eyes glinted with a spark of amusement. "Exactly, Watson. Too exactly. A thumbprint left in the chaos of a struggle or a crime should bear signs of smudging, of haste, of imperfection. This one was pristine, as if placed with care. It suggests not an act of violence, but an act of artifice." I frowned, struggling to follow his reasoning. "You mean to say it was forged? But how could such a thing be done?" Holmes rose and crossed to his chemical table, where a clutter of vials, burners, and papers lay in organized disarray. "There are methods, Watson, known to those with ingenuity. A thumbprint can be lifted, transferred, if you will, from one surface to another. Wax, ink, or even a gelatin mold can capture the ridges of a finger and reproduce them elsewhere. I suspect our culprit employed such a technique to implicate MacFarlane. To illustrate, he took a sheet of paper and a small pot of ink, pressing his own thumb into it and then transferring the print to another surface with a piece of wax. The result, though crude, bore a striking resemblance to the original. With care, he said, and access to MacFarlane's print, say, from a document he handled in Oldacre's study, the task becomes child's play." I nodded, impressed by the simplicity of the method. "But why go to such lengths? If Oldacre is dead, who would wish to frame MacFarlane?" Holmes's expression grew grave. "That, Watson, is the question. The thumbprint, the fire, the remains are part of a design, and I suspect Oldacre himself is at its heart. But we need more than suspicion. Tomorrow, we shall visit Scotland Yard and examine the official records of the thumbprint. Lestrade's confidence may yet be his undoing." The next morning, we made our way to Scotland Yard, where the air was thick with the bustle of constables and the clatter of typewriters. Lestrade received us in his cramped office, his desk piled high with reports. He greeted Holmes with his usual blend of wariness and bravado, producing a photograph of the thumbprint with a flourish. "Here it is, Holmes," said he, clear as day. "We took MacFarlane's prints when he was questioned, and they're a perfect match. You can't argue with science. Holmes took the photograph, studying it through his magnifying lens with the intensity of a scholar deciphering a cipher. The print was indeed sharp, its lines unmarred by the chaos one might expect in a violent scene. He compared it to a set of Macfarlane's prints provided by Lestrade, and his lips curved in a faint, satisfied smile. Science, Lestrade, is only as reliable as the hands that wield it, he said. This print is flawless, flawless. Observe the edges. No smudging, no distortion. A man fleeing a crime does not pause to press his thumb so neatly against a wall. And the blood, why is it only here and nowhere else in the hall? Lestrade bristled. You're chasing shadows, Holmes. The blood came from Oldacre, struck down by Macfarlane. The fire destroyed the rest. Holmes handed back the photograph. We shall see. Have you had the remains analyzed by a medical expert? Not yet, Lestrade admitted. They're too burned for much, but we've sent them to Dr. Hargrove at Bart's. He'll confirm they're Oldacre's. Mark my words. Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. Inform me when Dr. Hargrove's report is ready. In the meantime, I shall pursue my own inquiries. We left Scotland Yard and returned to Baker Street, where Holmes at once set to work. He produced the fragment of bone he had taken from the garden, placing it under a microscope and examining it with meticulous care. I watched as he mixed reagents, testing the ash for traces of organic material, his movements swift and precise. Curious, he murmured, peering through the lens. The bone is brittle, as one might expect from intense heat, but its structure is not entirely consistent with human remains. There is a density here that suggests something else, perhaps animal. I stared, incredulous. Animal? You mean to say the remains are not Oldacre's? Holmes straightened, his expression guarded. I mean to say nothing until I am certain. But if these are not human, then our case takes a very different turn. A man does not burn animal bones in his garden without purpose, Watson. That evening, Holmes retreated to his chemical table, conducting experiments with wax, ink, and blood, seeking to replicate the thumbprint's clarity. I watched, fascinated, as he pressed various surfaces against paper, muttering about pressure and texture. At one point, he produced a small vial of pig's blood, obtained from a butcher, and tested its consistency against the sample he had scraped from the hallway wall. The blood, he said, is human, but its application is suspect. It was not smeared in haste, but placed with intent. This is no mere crime, Watson, it is a performance. As the clock struck midnight, Holmes set aside his instruments and lit a fresh pipe. Tomorrow, he said, we shall return to Norwood and seek those letters in Oldacre's desk. If they exist, they may tell us who had reason to stage this elaborate deception. I retired to my room, my mind awhirl with the day's discoveries. The thumbprint, once a damning piece of evidence, now seemed a deliberate fabrication, and the remains, far from confirming Oldacre's death, raised questions about his fate. Holmes's relentless logic was peeling back the layers of the mystery, and I knew that the truth, however elusive, could not long evade his grasp. Chapter 6. A trail of ashes. The dawn of the following day broke with a sullen drizzle, casting a pall over London that matched the deepening complexity of the Norwood mystery. Sherlock Holmes, however, was undaunted by the weather, his lean frame already clad in his ulster and cap when I joined him at breakfast. The table was strewn with the detritus of his nocturnal labours, vials of chemicals, scraps of wax, and a microscope slide bearing the bone fragment from Deep Dean House. His eyes, bright with purpose, betrayed none of the fatigue one might expect from a man who had worked through the night. "Good morning, Watson," said he, pouring coffee with a steady hand. "We returned to Norwood today. The ashes in Oldacre's garden hold secrets yet, and I mean to uncover them. But first, we must secure a sample for proper analysis." I nodded, accustomed to his brisk transitions from contemplation to action. "You still suspect the remains are not human?" "I suspect nothing until the facts confirm it," he replied, though the glint in his eye suggested a hypothesis already forming. "But the uniformity of those bones, and their curious density, raises questions Lestrade has not thought to ask. Come, finish your breakfast. We have work to do." We caught an early train to Norwood, the carriage rattling through a landscape blurred by rain. Holmes sat in silence, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm, his mind, no doubt, sifting through the threads of the case, the fabricated thumbprint, the peculiar will, and the housekeeper's cryptic mention of a woman named Vanda. I, too, pondered these fragments, wondering what motive could drive such an elaborate scheme to implicate young Macfarlane. Deepdene House stood as forlorn as ever, its blackened timbers glistening in the wet. The constables had reduced their presence, leaving only one man at the gate, who recognized Holmes and waved us through with a nod. The garden, where the supposed remains of Jonas Oldacre had been found, was our destination. The tarpaulin still covered the heap of ashes and bones, though the rain had seeped through, turning the edges to a sodden mush. Holmes knelt beside it, heedless of the mud, and began sifting through the debris with a small trowel he had brought from Baker Street. His movements were methodical, his eyes scanning each fragment with the intensity of a jeweler examining a gem. He extracted several more pieces of bone, their surfaces blackened and cracked, and placed them in a small tin box. A scrap of charred cloth caught his attention, and he held it to the light, noting its texture and weave. "This cloth," he murmured, "is coarse, not the fine wool or linen one might expect of Oldacre's attire. And these bones, observe the size, Watson. They are too small for a man of his build, yet too uniform for a haphazard collection." I peered at the fragments, my medical training straining to make sense of them. "They could be animal," I ventured. "Perhaps rabbit or fowl, burned to mimic human remains." Holmes's lips twitched in approval. "Well reasoned, Watson. That is precisely my suspicion. But we shall need a chemist's confirmation. These will go to Mr. Stapleton at the Norwood apothecary, a man with a microscope and a knowledge of osteology." We left the garden and made our way to the town's High Street, where the apothecary's shop stood, its windows displaying bottles of tinctures and powders. Mr. Stapleton, a wiry man with spectacles perched on a thin nose, greeted us with professional courtesy. Holmes handed him the tin box, explaining the need for an analysis of the bone fragments. "I want to know their origin," Holmes said. "Human, animal, or otherwise. And the cloth test, its composition. I shall return for your report tomorrow." Stapleton nodded, intrigued by the task, and we departed. Holmes, however, was not yet done with Deepdene House. He led me back to the ruined study, where the fire had begun. The room was a skeleton of its former self, the desk a charred husk, its drawers warped by heat. Holmes examined the floor, where the oil stain from the broken lamp still marked the point of origin. "The fire started here," he said, crouching to inspect the stain. "But observe the pattern, Watson. The burn marks radiate outward in a manner suggesting not a single spill, but a deliberate pour. Someone ensured this room would be consumed." I frowned, picturing the scene. "You think the fire was set intentionally?" not by accident." "I am certain of it," Holmes replied, "and I suspect Oldacre himself had a hand in it. But we need more than suspicion." His attention turned to the desk, where McFarlane had mentioned a locked drawer containing letters. The fire had damaged the lock, and Holmes, with a deft twist of a pocket knife, pried it open. Inside was a bundle of papers, singed but intact, tied with a frayed string. He untied it carefully, revealing a collection of letters in a feminine hand, their ink faded but legible. Holmes scanned the first, his eyes narrowing. "These are from a Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt," he said. "Listen to this, Watson. You cannot evade me, Jonas. The debt is due, and I will have my share, or all of London shall know your shame." I started. "Blackmail?" "So it appears," Holmes said, folding the letters into his pocket. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, it seems, had a hold over Oldacre. This may explain his desire to start fresh, as Mrs. Lexington reported. We searched the study further, uncovering a small ledger beneath a pile of debris. Its pages detailed Oldacre's financial transactions, revealing a pattern of large withdrawals over the past year, many marked with cryptic initial CV, presumably for Cornelia Vanderbilt. The sums were substantial, enough to strain even a man of Oldacre's wealth. "This," Holmes said, tapping the ledger, "suggests a motive. Oldacre was bleeding money to this woman, and the fire may have been his attempt to escape her grasp." We left Deep Dean House as the rain intensified, the ledger and letters safely stowed in Holmes's satchel. On the train back to London, he sat in silence, his fingers steepled, his mind weaving the new evidence into the tapestry of the case. I ventured to break his reverie. "Holmes," said I, "if Oldacre staged the fire and planted the thumbprint, where is he now, and why frame McFarlane?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar fire. "Those are the questions, Watson. Oldacre is either dead, in which case we seek a cunning murderer, or alive, in which case he is the architect of this deception. As for McFarlane, I suspect his role is incidental, a convenient scapegoat, perhaps tied to some personal grudge. The letters and ledger will guide us to the truth." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the letters on the table, reading each with meticulous care. They painted a picture of a desperate Oldacre, ensnared by Mrs. Vanderbilt's demands. His threats of exposure met with her unrelenting pressure. One letter hinted at a meeting, arranged for the night of the fire, though it was unclear whether it had occurred. Holmes dispatched a telegram to an associate in London, requesting information on Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt. "If she is the key," he said, "we must know her movements and her history. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall have Stapleton's report and, I hope, a clearer picture of Oldacre's fate." As I retired, the rain pattered against the windows, and I could hear Holmes pacing, his pipe smoke curling in the lamplight. The trail of ashes was leading us closer to the heart of the mystery, and I knew that Sherlock Holmes, with his relentless logic, would not rest until every secret was laid bare. Chapter 7. The hidden motive. The drizzle of the previous day had given way to a sharp, clear morning, the kind that sharpens the senses and lends a crisp edge to thought. At 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes was already at his desk when I descended. Surrounded by the letters and ledger we had retrieved from Deep Dean House, his pipe, unlit but clenched between his teeth, betrayed the intensity of his focus, and the faint aroma of coffee mingled with the familiar scent of his chemical experiments. The bone fragments and cloth from the garden lay in a tin box nearby, awaiting the results of Mr. Stapleton's analysis. But it was clear that Holmes's mind was now fixed on the papers before him. "Good morning, Watson," said he, without Looking up, we are on the cusp of a revelation, I believe. These letters from Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt are a thread that may unravel the entire skein of this affair. I joined him at the table, glancing at the spidery handwriting of the letters. You think she is the key to Oldacre's disappearance? Holmes's eyes glinted with that peculiar light that signaled a hypothesis taking shape. She is certainly a key, Watson, though whether to his disappearance or his deception remains to be seen. Come, let us examine the evidence. He spread the letters before us, their tone ranging from cajoling to menacing. Each was signed by Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt, a name that had surfaced in Mrs. Lexington's guarded recollection. The earliest, dated some 6 months prior, was almost cordial, requesting a meeting to discuss mutual interests. But as the correspondence progressed, the language grew sharper, with veiled threats of exposure and demands for sums that grew ever larger. One passage, from a letter dated 2 weeks before the fire, stood out. You cannot hide forever, Jonas. The truth will out, and I shall have my due, or all of Norwood shall know your shame. Blackmail, without question, I said, my indignation rising. She was bleeding him dry. Holmes nodded, his fingers tracing the lines of the ledger. Indeed, Watson. Observe the entries here: withdrawals, marked CV, totaling nearly £20,000 over the past year. Oldacre was a wealthy man, but even his resources were not inexhaustible. These payments suggest a secret he was desperate to keep. Hidden, I frowned, considering the implications. What could she have known about him? A scandal in his business dealings, perhaps. Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. Possibly, but I suspect something more personal. Oldacre was a bachelor, reclusive, with no known kin. Yet Mrs. Lexington hinted at his agitation, his talk of starting fresh. A man does not burn letters and stage a fire without a motive. Rooted in fear or desperation, we were interrupted by the arrival of a telegram, which Holmes read with a quick glance. From my associate, Wiggins, he said. Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt is a widow, residing in Kensington, known in certain circles for her charm and her less savory habit of extracting money from wealthy men. She has no criminal record, but her name is whispered in connection with several ruined reputations. We shall pay her a visit, but first we must return to Norwood for Stapleton's report. The train to Norwood was a familiar journey now, its rhythm almost soothing despite the weight of the case. The apothecary's shop was quiet when we arrived, and Mr. Stapleton greeted us with a look of quiet excitement. He led us to a back room, where a microscope and a tray of chemical apparatus stood ready. Mr. Holmes, said he, I've examined the samples you provided. The bones are not human. They are consistent with those of a rabbit, likely several burned to a uniform char. The cloth is coarse cotton, such as might be used for sacking, not the attire of a gentleman like Mr. Oldacre. Holmes's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. As I suspected, the remains were a fabrication meant to suggest a body where none existed. Thank you, Mr. Stapleton. Your work is most valuable. As we left the shop, I could not contain my astonishment. Holmes, this changes everything. If the remains are not Oldacre's, then he may still be alive. Precisely. Holmes replied, his tone crisp. The fire, the thumbprint, the bones all are parts of a charade, likely orchestrated by Oldacre himself. But why? To escape Mrs. Vanderbilt's blackmail, or for some other purpose? And why implicate McFarlane? We returned to Deepdene House, where Holmes insisted on a final search of the study. The ruined desk yielded little more, but beneath a fallen bookcase, He uncovered a small, locked safe, its surface scorched but intact. With a set of picks from his pocket, Holmes opened it in moments, revealing a bundle of documents, deeds, contracts, and a second ledger, this one detailing Oldacre's investments. Many were marked as failing, with notes of debts owed to creditors across London. Oldacre's wealth was a facade, Holmes said, scanning the pages. He was overextended, his properties mortgaged, his funds drained by Vanderbilt's demands. This explains his desperation, but not his choice of McFarlane as a scapegoat. I ventured a theory. Could McFarlane have known something about Oldacre's finances? As a solicitor, he might have seen these ledgers. Holmes shook his head. Unlikely. McFarlane was a junior partner, engaged only for the will. No, the motive lies elsewhere, perhaps in some personal connection we have yet to uncover. Back at Baker Street, Holmes dispatched another telegram, this time to summon Wiggins for a detailed report on Mrs. Vanderbilt's movements. While we waited, he paced the room, the letters and ledgers spread before him like a map of Oldacre's life. "Consider the sequence, Watson," he said. Oldacre, pressed by debts and blackmail, drafts a will that leaves his estate to charities, ensuring no one close to him benefits. He arranges a late-night meeting with McFarlane, plants a thumbprint, and sets a fire, leaving animal bones. To simulate his death. Why? To vanish, to escape his creditors and Vanderbilt's grasp. But McFarlane's role, why him? I recalled McFarlane's account of the night. He said Oldacre was nervous, locking the door, glancing at the window. Perhaps he feared Vanderbilt would appear. Holmes nodded slowly. Or someone else. The letters mention a meeting on the night of the fire, but we have no proof it occurred. We need to know more of Vanderbilt's actions and of Oldacre's past. Wiggins arrived that evening, a wiry lad from Holmes's irregulars, his cap pulled low over sharp eyes. "Mrs. Vanderbilt's been quiet, sir," he reported. "Seen at her Kensington house, but no visitors the night of the fire. Word is, she's been asking after Oldacre, saying he owes her money." Holmes dismissed Wiggins with a coin and turned to me. "Vanderbilt is a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole. Tomorrow we shall confront her and learn what hold she had over Oldacre. For now, Watson, we have a motive: escape from ruin. But the method and the man remain elusive." As I retired, Holmes remained at his desk, the letters glowing in the lamplight. The hidden motive was coming into focus, but the shadow of Jonas Oldacre loomed large, and I knew that only Holmes's relentless pursuit would bring the truth to light. Chapter 8. The trap is sprung. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of 2-1B Baker Street, casting a pale glow over the cluttered room where Sherlock Holmes sat, his lean figure hunched over the letters and ledgers of Jonas Oldacre. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the faint chemical temps of his recent experiments, evidence of a night spent piecing together the final threads of the Norwood mystery. I had grown accustomed to his relentless pace, but the intensity in his eyes as he glanced up from his papers suggested that the climax of the case was near. "Good morning, Watson," said he, his voice brisk. "Today we shall bring this affair to a close. The trap is set, and I fancy our quarry will not escape it." I joined him at the table, where the letters from Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt lay beside the ledger detailing Oldacre's financial ruin. "You mean to confront Mrs. Vanderbilt?" I asked, recalling the blackmailing widow who seemed to hold the key to Oldacre's desperation. Holmes shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Not yet, Watson. She is a piece of the puzzle, but the heart of this deception lies elsewhere. We return to Norwood, and I have sent word to Lestrade to meet us at Deepdene House. There is one final corner of that ruin we have not explored, and I believe it holds the answer. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The house, but we've searched it thoroughly. The study, the garden, the safe. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire that signaled a revelation. Not thoroughly enough, Watson. A man like Oldacre, cunning and desperate, does not vanish without a plan. I suspect he is closer than we think. We caught the early train to Norwood, the journey marked by Holmes's uncharacteristic silence. His fingers steepled as he gazed out at the rain-soaked suburbs. I knew better than to press him, but my mind raced with possibilities. The fabricated thumbprint, the animal bones, the blackmail letters all pointed to a scheme orchestrated by Oldacre himself. Yet the question of his whereabouts and his motive for framing Macfarlane remained unanswered at Deepdene House. The charred remains of the estate loomed under a leaden sky, the air still heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth. Inspector Lestrade awaited us at the gate, his ferret-like features set in a scowl of impatience. Beside him stood a constable, and I noted a flicker of curiosity in Lestrade's eyes, despite his air of skepticism. "Well, Holmes," said he, "you've dragged me out here again. I hope you've something more than theories this time." Macfarlane's prints are on the wall, the remains are in the garden, and the case is as good as closed. Holmes's lips curled in a sardonic smile. "Your faith in the obvious is commendable, Lestrade, but misguided. Follow me, and keep your wits about you." He led us into the house, bypassing the scorched hallway and study, and ascended the creaking stairs to the upper floors. The fire had spared much of the second story, though the walls were stained with soot and the air thick with mildew. Holmes moved with purpose, his steps leading us to a narrow corridor at the back of the house, where a low door, half hidden by a tattered curtain, opened onto a steep staircase. "The attic," Holmes said, producing a small lantern from his pocket. "A place overlooked in the haste of your investigation, Lestrade." The constable lit a second lantern, and we climbed the stairs, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The attic was a low, cavernous space, its beams blackened by age rather than fire. Trunks, crates, and forgotten furniture were piled haphazardly, casting long shadows in the lantern light. Holmes moved among them, his eyes scanning every corner, until he paused before a section of wall that appeared no different from the rest. "Observe," said he, tapping the wood with his knuckles. The sound was hollow, unlike the solid thud of the surrounding panels. With a deft movement, he pressed against the wall, and a concealed panel sprang open, revealing a small chamber beyond. Lestrade gasped, and I felt a chill that had little to do with the cold. Inside the chamber, crouched amidst a pile of blankets and provisions, was a man disheveled, sallow-faced, but unmistakably alive. It was Jonas Oldacre. "Great Scott!" Lestrade exclaimed, his hand reaching for his cuffs. "Oldacre, you're alive!" The man shrank back, his eyes wild with fear and defiance. "You've no right," he cried, his voice hoarse. "This is my house." Holmes stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "Your house, Mr. Oldacre, and your scheme. But the game is up. You staged your death, planted the thumbprint, and burned animal bones to implicate Mr. Macfarlane. Now you will explain why." Oldacre's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as Lestrade and the constable pulled him from the chamber. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven, but there was no mistaking the cunning that still flickered in his eyes. Holmes motioned for us to return to the study, where we could question him in relative comfort. In the ruined study, with the constable standing guard, Oldacre sat heavily in a chair, his hands clasped as if to steady himself. Holmes stood before him, his lantern casting stark shadows across the room. "Speak, Mr. Oldacre," said he, his voice cold. "The truth, or I shall ensure the full weight of the law falls upon you." Oldacre licked his lips, his gaze darting between Holmes and Lestrade. "It was the only way," he began, his voice low. "I was ruined, debts piling up, investments gone sour, and that woman Cornelia Vanderbilt, she had me in her grip. Letters, promises, secrets from years ago. She demanded more than I could pay, threatening to ruin me in Norwood and beyond." Holmes nodded, unsurprised. "So you devised a plan to vanish, to escape her and your creditors?" Oldacre's eyes flickered with resentment. I'd heard of your McFarlane, a young solicitor with a reputation for honesty. I chose him for the will, knowing he'd be the perfect dupe. I lifted his thumbprint from a glass he touched in my study, pressed it in blood from a cut on my own hand, and set the fire with oil. The bones, rabbit bones, from the butcher were to make it seem I'd perished. I planned to hide here, then slip away to the continent with what little I'd saved. I stared, appalled by the cold calculation of it. "But why McFarlane? What had he done to you?" Oldacre's lip curled. "He courted my niece, Emily, years ago. I forbade it. She was too good for a penniless clerk. When I learned he'd become a solicitor, I saw my chance to settle an old score and divert suspicion." Lestrade, red-faced with indignation, stepped forward. "You'll answer for this, Oldacre. Arson, fraud, and attempted murder by false accusation." Holmes raised a hand, silencing him. "One moment, Lestrade. Mr. Oldacre, what of Mrs. Vanderbilt? Did she know of your plan?" Oldacre shook his head. "She suspected I might bolt, but not this. I sent her a final payment the day before, hoping to keep her quiet until I was gone." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You have your man, Inspector. The thumbprint was forged, the remains a sham, and the fire a deliberate act. Mr. McFarlane is innocent, and I trust you will see to his release." Lestrade, though grudging, nodded. "I'll admit, Holmes, you've outdone me this time. Oldacre, you're under arrest." As the constable led Oldacre away, Holmes and I stepped into the garden, where the rain had ceased and a pale sun broke through the clouds. "A neat scheme, Watson," said he, lighting a cigarette. Oldacre nearly succeeded, but he underestimated the power of observation and reason. I smiled, relieved at the resolution. "And McFarlane is free, thanks to you." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "Thanks to the truth, Watson. Now, let us return to Baker Street. I fancy a quiet evening by the fire, and perhaps a touch of Batch on the violin." As we boarded the train, the weight of the case lifted, and I marveled once more at the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes, who had sprung the trap and brought light to the shadows of Deep Dean House. The end.